The first ball of the autumn season at Ashbourne House was lit by 400 candles, and Charlotte Vane stood at the edge of it in a gown the color of weak tea. The silk had been turned twice. The hem had been let down and taken up again until the old creases showed in the candlelight like the grain in worn wood, and she had chosen it for exactly that reason. She wished to be looked at and then dismissed. She wished, on this particular night, for the room to decide it knew everything about her in one glance, and then to forget she was there. A woman who is forgotten can move through a room and hear what is said in it, and Charlotte had come to Ashbourne House to hear a great deal. Across the floor, near the terrace doors, a man stood who did not dance, and did not pretend to wish he were dancing. He was tall, dressed in a navy coat, so plainly cut that its cost showed only to those who understood the price of restraint, and his face was still in the way of a man who had stopped expecting the evening to surprise him. Sebastian Thorne, the Duke of Wexford, watched the dancers the way a man watches whether he must travel through. He had buried a wife 18 months before. The season had decided he was grieving, or proud, or both, and had arranged itself around his silence. Accordingly, he was not looking at anyone. Then a girl in a tea-colored gown crossed the corner of his vision, and something in him went briefly, unaccountably, still. He did not know yet why. Neither did she. You will, though, before this night is finished, and I think you will want to stay for it. It was Lady Marjorie Holt who fixed the verdict on Charlotte first, because Lady Marjorie fixed verdicts the way other women fixed flowers, with care and an eye to the room. She stood with her daughter near the orchestra, her fan moving at the precise height that announced her own importance, and as Charlotte passed she let her voice carry the exact distance required. "The Vane girl," she said. "One does feel for the family, though. I confess I cannot think why they sent her up at all. A poor little brown moth among the candles. She will dance with no one, and quite right, too." Her daughter laughed the soft practiced laugh of a girl who had been told her whole life that she was the correct choice, and the words settled over Charlotte's shoulders like a shawl she had not asked for. Charlotte heard every syllable. She had meant to. A poor little brown moth. She turned the phrase over once, found it useful, and let it lie where it had fallen. The world's misreading of her was the most reliable tool she had ever owned, and she had learned long ago to keep it sharp. Her father had taught her that, in the years before the debts came, and the house in Wiltshire passed to her cousin, and the word ruined began to follow the Vane name through drawing-rooms like a draft. Under a door. "Show them the woman they expect," he had told her once, his hand on the worn brass key he wore on his watch chain, "and they will never trouble to look for the one who is actually here." She had that key now. It hung on a ribbon beneath her bodice, against her skin, where no one could see it. It was the key to her father's study at Wiltshire, the room where he had kept his accounts and his correspondence, and it was the only thing of his she had not been forced to sell. She had come to Ashbourne House because Lord Ashbourne's man of business, a creditor named Mr. Creditor, Felix Crane, would be among the guests, and because Charlotte had reason to believe that the debts that had ruined her father had not been honest debts at all. To understand why a gentlewoman of 23 would dress herself as a moth, and walk willingly into a room that despised her, you must understand what she had lost and how. Her father, Edmund Vane, had not been a careless man. He had been a trusting one, which in the end proved more expensive. In the last year of his life, a scheme had been laid against him, a slow, patient theft dressed in the language of investment, and by the time he understood it, the Wiltshire estate was mortgaged past saving, and his name was attached to obligations he had never knowingly made. He had died believing himself a fool. Charlotte did not believe it. She believed he had been robbed, and she believed the hand that robbed him still moved freely through the better houses of London, holding a fan or a glass of claret and laughing at jokes. So she had made herself small. She had let the season name her a poor little brown moth, because moths are not watched, and she needed very badly not to be watched, while she found Mr. Crane and listened to him, and learned the shape of what he knew. The Duke of Wexford found her near the supper-room an hour later, though find is perhaps the wrong word for a man who told himself he was merely walking. He had watched her, in the meantime, in the deniable way of a man who would have denied it. He had seen her refuse a glass of wine with a small, precise gesture, the gesture of a woman who intends to keep her wits intact. He had seen her decline to be drawn into the cluster of unmarried girls along the wall where safety was, and drift, instead, toward the edges of conversations among the older men. He had seen her face arrange itself into pleasant vacancy each time a gentleman glanced her way, and he had seen the vacancy drop the instant the glance moved on, replaced by something so alert and exact that it had made him set down his own glass. "You are not dancing," he said. Charlotte looked up at him. She had not heard him approach, which troubled her because she heard everything. He stood very close, taller than she had judged from across the room, and his eyes were a gray so dark they were nearly the color of the smoke that rose off the candle snuffers, and they were fixed on her with an attention she did not know how to file. She gave him the moth's face, the pleasant, empty one. "No, Your Grace," she said. "I am not much sought after this evening." "That gown," he said. Here it came. She braced for it, almost grateful, because a man who insults a woman's gown is a man who has decided she is beneath his notice, and a man who has decided that will say a great many useful things in front of her without remembering she is there. "It is an old gown," she agreed pleasantly. "I am sure Your Grace has seen finer." "It is a deliberate gown," he said. The pleasant emptiness on her face did not move, but something behind it did. A small, cold drop, like a stone going into a well. She had been called many things across many ballrooms. She had been called provincial and pitiable, and poor and plain. No one, in 3 seasons of careful disappearing, had ever called her deliberate. "I cannot think what Your Grace means," she said. "You came in a gown chosen to be overlooked," he said, his voice level and low, pitched for her alone. "You have refused wine, refused the dance, and refused every conversation that might fix you in someone's memory. You are watching the room as carefully as I have ever seen anyone watch it. I have spent 18 months being watched, by people who wished me to forget I could see them doing it. I know the difference between a woman the room is ignoring and a woman who has arranged to be ignored. You, Miss Vane, are the second kind." He paused. "I find I am curious why." For a moment Charlotte could not breathe properly. The key against her skin felt suddenly heavy, suddenly visible, as though he could see straight through the turned silk to the thing she had hidden. No one had seen her in 3 years. She had built her whole survival on not being seen. And this grieving, granite-faced duke had crossed a crowded ballroom and undone it in the space of 4 sentences. She did the only thing she could. She lied. "Your Grace flatters a dull woman with a clever theory," she said. And she smiled the moth smile and stepped back. She was gone into the crowd before he could answer, her pulse going hard and quick in her throat the whole length of the supper room. She did not see him watch her go. She did not see him stand there a moment longer than a man ought, turning the brass watch chain in his fingers, the chain from which his late wife's small portrait had once hung, and from which he had removed it the morning after the funeral and never replaced it. She did not see the Duke of Wexford do something he had not done in 18 months, which was wonder about a living person rather than a dead one. In the days that followed, Charlotte learned 3 things, and the Duke learned 1. She learned that Mr. Felix Crane was a careful man who drank more than careful men should, and that drink loosened the careful hinges of his speech. She learned this by attending a card party, at which she was once again the brown moth in the corner, seated with her embroidery near the fire, while the gentlemen played at the far table and forgot, as gentlemen did, that the quiet woman with the needle had ears. Crane lost steadily. He lost the way a frightened man loses, throwing good coin after bad to feel something other than the thing he was feeling, and between hands he talked. He talked of the late Mr. Brond, Harkness, who had been such a friend, gone these 2 years now, and of poor Sir John Whitby, who had followed him into the churchyard within the 12th month, and Charlotte heard in the loose run of his grief that both men had trusted Crane with their affairs, and both men had died with their estates strangely thin. She learned, before the candles guttered, that in each case, a portion of the money had drained away into a name she did not recognize, a company called the Meridian Trading Company that existed mostly on paper and chiefly to receive. And she learned, when she contrived to be left alone for 90 seconds in the small antechamber where Crane had set down his pocketbook to be helped into his greatcoat, that the name behind the company was written on a folded sheet tucked into the leather, in a hand she would have known anywhere. She had seen that hand at the bottom of her father's mortgage. It was a fine, sloping, gentleman's hand, and it was not Crane's. Crane wrote a clerk's cramped fist. Crane was the instrument. The hand that had signed the thing into being belonged to someone who stood far above a man of business, someone who moved through these rooms with a title and a glass of claret and the certainty of never being asked a single difficult question. What the Duke learned was simpler and harder to put down. He learned that he could not stop thinking about a woman in a tea-colored gown. He saw her next at the Holt Musicale, where Lady Marjorie had arranged her drawing room into rows, and her daughter into the best light, and the whole afternoon into a quiet advertisement of the daughter's accomplishments. Charlotte sat at the back. She had come because Crane would be there, and Crane was there near the window, looking ill. The Duke came because he had been told the Duke ought to be seen, and because, though he did not say this even to himself, the Holts had let slip that the Vane girl had been invited, and he had wished to know if she would come. Key. He watched her again. This was the witnessing, though neither of them would have called it that. Midway through the afternoon, a child slipped into the drawing room, a small girl of perhaps 6 in a white frock, the daughter of one of the musicians, who had wandered up from the servants' passage and stood frozen at the edge of all those grand-seated adults with the particular terror of a child who knows she is somewhere she must not be. Lady Marjorie's gaze swung toward her like a lamp. Charlotte saw it coming, the public correction, the cold word that would mark the child for the whole room and send her crying back down the stairs. Charlotte rose before it could land. She did it without appearing to hurry, without the sharp movement that would have drawn the room's eye to the child and sealed the very shame she meant to prevent. She crossed to the girl as though she had merely thought of something in another part of the house. Unhurried, ordinary, and she knelt down to the girl's height, in her turned-silk gown on the cold, polished floor, heedless of what the kneeling did to the old creases of the skirt, and she said something low and kind that no one else could hear. The child's lip stopped trembling. Charlotte took the small hand in her own gloved one and rose with her, and she walked the girl quietly back toward the servants' passage, and as she passed the rows of seated grandeur, she paused beside Lady Marjorie, just long enough to murmur that the little one had a message for the players below. It was a lie, and it was graceful, and it gave Lady Marjorie a reason to let the moment close that cost no one anything but Charlotte, and it cost Charlotte the one thing she had been guarding all season, which was her invisibility. Heads turned to follow the plain brown gown across the bright room. Whispers moved along the rows. The moth had moved, and in moving had become, for one unbearable minute, the most visible person present. The Duke of Wexford watched her kneel on the floor in her deliberately plain gown, watched her spend her own carefully hoarded anonymity to spare a servant's child a moment of public shame, and he understood, with the particular clarity of a man who had spent a year and a half believing himself incapable of being surprised, that he had been wrong about a great many things, but he had been right about her. She was not what the room had decided. She was something the room did not have the wit to see. If you have ever been the person the room decided not to look at, you already know what she felt walking back to her seat with every eye upon her. Stay with her. The looking is not finished. The Dowager came for her after that. The Dowager Duchess of Wexford, Sebastian's mother, was a woman who had spent 40 years as the keeper of her family's consequence, and she had noticed her son's stillness across 2 separate rooms, and she had traced it to its source with the unsentimental efficiency of a hawk. She found Charlotte in the card-room 3 nights later, at a private supper to which Charlotte had been invited only because the hostess wished to seem charitable, and she sat down beside her with a rustle of gray silk and a cool greeting that adjusted itself downward the instant she had confirmed the girl's identity. "Miss Vane," she said, "I am told you have been much about this season. How brave of you." She let the word brave sit. A young woman in your situation, with your family's difficulties, and no fortune to speak of. One admires the persistence, though I will be frank with you, my dear, as no one else will trouble to be. You are reaching above your station, and the reaching is beginning to show. My son is grieving, and not himself, and a clever girl with nothing to lose might mistake his courtesy for something. It is not. I should hate to see you embarrassed. The Vane girl chasing a duke. People are already saying it, she smiled. Do consider, before the saying grows louder, how very little a moth gains by flying at a flame. There it was again, a poor little brown moth, returned to her in the dowager's polished mouth, sharpened now into a warning. Charlotte felt her face do its work. The pleasant emptiness, while underneath it the old cold stone dropped down the old deep well. "Your Grace is very kind to advise me," she said. "I assure you I have no designs above my station. I came to London on a matter of my late father's business, and I shall leave when it is concluded. See that you do," said the dowager, and rose and was gone in a hiss of silk. Charlotte sat very still. She had told the dowager the truth, which was a luxury she rarely permitted herself, and the truth had cost her nothing because no one ever believed the moth. The encounter had taught her something. All the same, the dowager had said, "My son's courtesy," as though courtesy were the most the Duke had ever shown anyone, and Charlotte understood for the first time that the granite stillness she had taken for arrogance was something else entirely. It was a man holding himself together. She did not know yet what had broken him. She found out the following week, and she found out by accident. In the one place in London she had not expected to be undone. It was at Wexford's own library. The matter of her father's business had led her by a chain of careful inquiries to a senior gentleman of the law named Mr. Stem. Aldous Pike, a solicitor who had once handled affairs for several great houses, and who now half retired, kept his papers in order and his opinions to himself. Mr. Pike, it transpired, was an old friend of the Duke's late father, and was a guest at Wexford House for a fortnight, and Charlotte, who needed badly to speak with him, had accepted an invitation to a small literary evening there for no other reason. She had slipped away from the company to find the library, where Mr. Pike was said to retreat. And she had found, instead, the Duke. He was alone at the cold hearth, a single candle burning on the mantel beside him. He held something in his hand. When he heard the door, he did not startle, but he closed his fingers around the thing he held in a gesture so swift and so practiced that Charlotte understood at once she had walked in on a wound. He looked at her across the shelves of leather spines, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and the candle moved its small light over his still face. "Miss Vane," he said, "you are lost." "I was looking for Mr. Pike," she said. "Forgive me, I will go." "Stay," he said. It was a command, level and low, the way all his words were commands. She heard this time, for the first time, the thing the dowager's word courtesy had pointed at. She heard that the command was a request he did not know how to make. So she stayed. She crossed the room, and she did not pry, and after a while he opened his hand, because a man who has held a thing alone for 18 months will sometimes show it to the one person who has not come to take anything from him. It was a small portrait, an oval miniature in a worn gold frame, the painted face of a young woman with a gentle mouth. "My wife," he said. "Eleanor, she died of a fever I was certain would pass. I was in town on business I have since forgotten the substance of, and I sent word that I would come when the week's affairs were settled. And the affairs were not worth a single hour of the time they cost me. She asked for me at the end. I was not there. I have told myself for a year and a half that a wiser man would have read the danger sooner. I keep her likeness because I do not deserve to set it down." He closed his hand again. "I have not said that aloud to anyone." Charlotte stood in the candlelight and did not offer him comfort, because she had learned that comfort offered too quickly is a way of asking the wounded to stop bleeding for the comforter's sake. She said only she asked for you because she loved you. The asking was not an accusation. You have made it one. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Who taught you to see people this clearly?" "My father," she said. "It is the only fortune he was able to leave me." And because the moment had pried something open in her too, she nearly told him the rest. Nearly told him about the key against her skin, and the debts that were not honest, and the hand she had recognized in Crane's pocketbook. She did not. Not yet. She carried the warmth of that candlelit hour out of the library with her, and it frightened her more than the Dowager ever had, because warmth was the one thing her plan had not accounted for. The hand she had recognized belonged to the Earl of Sandhurst. She confirmed it through Mr. Gadd. Pike, who was, beneath his caution, a deeply honest man and who had handled enough estates to recognize the shape of a fraud when a clever young woman laid the pieces before him on a quiet morning over weak tea. Sandhurst had been her father's friend. Sandhurst had introduced Edmund Vane to the investment that ruined him, had vouched for Crane, had stood at the funeral with a black armband and a long face. And Sandhurst, Charlotte, now understood, had done the same to two other men and had built upon their bones a fortune that the season called fortunate and Charlotte called theft. He was a guest, of course, at every house worth attending. He would be at the Wexford engagement ball, for there was to be an engagement ball, and this was the dark turn the season had been bending toward all along. The Dowager, having failed to frighten the moth away, had moved with the speed of a woman who does not lose. She had arranged matters. She had let it be known that the Duke of Wexford was to announce his engagement to Lady Marjorie Holt's daughter, the correct girl, the Diamond, at a ball at Wexford House at the season's height. And she had arranged for the Duke to understand that the announcement was already half public, that the families expected it, that to withdraw now would shame a blameless young woman before the whole of London. She had built him a cage out of his own honor, which is the only kind of cage that will hold an honorable man. And she had made certain by a few well-placed words that Charlotte Vane heard of the engagement, the way she heard of everything from the edge of a room, second-hand, too late. The Vane girl actually imagined she had a chance, said Lady Marjorie to a friend at the milliner's, not troubling to lower her voice. Certain the moth was not the sort to be present, though the moth was 3 counters away, choosing ribbons she would not buy. Can you conceive of it? A ruined nobody in a made-over gown, and she set her cap at a duke. Well, he announces for my Sophia on Thursday, and that will be the end of the poor little brown moth's flying. Some women never learn the height of their own ceiling. 3 times now the label had been spoken. Once by Lady Marjorie at the first ball to amuse her daughter. Once by the Dowager in the card-room, sharpened to a warning. And now, a 3rd time, at the milliner's, delivered as a victory before the victory was won. Charlotte stood among the ribbons, with her face perfectly still and her heart going down the well, and she understood that on Thursday she would lose 2 things at once. She would lose the man who had called her deliberate in a candle-lit library and shown her the face of his dead wife, and she would lose her one clear chance at Sandhurst, who would be at the ball, secure and smiling, while the room celebrated the marriage that sealed the Duke's house to the very society that had let her father be robbed. She did not weep. She went home to her small lodging, and she took the brass key from its ribbon, and she held it in her palm until it warmed, and she thought about what her father would have done. He would have trusted someone and been ruined for it. She would do the opposite. She would tell the truth, all of it, in the one place where the truth could not be quietly buried, and she would do it on Thursday, before the whole of London, even though it would finish her. Because the moth, it turned out, had not flown to London for a flame. She had flown for justice, and she had only mistaken the one for the other for a single warm hour in a library. The Wexford engagement ball filled the great house with light. The same 400 candles, or their cousins, threw the same gold over the same diamonds. and the Dowager Duchess of Wexford stood near the head of the room in grey silk and triumph, and Lady Marjorie's daughter waited in white and pearls to be claimed. And the Earl of Sandhurst moved through the crowd with a glass of claret, and the easy laugh of a man who had never once been caught. Charlotte came in a gown, the color of weak tea. She had thought about wearing something finer, and had decided against it, because she wished one last time to be underestimated, and because the moth's plainness was the truest armor she owned. She found Sandhurst near the card-room. She found Crane, too, pale and sweating at the edge of things, already half unmade by the burden of what he knew. And she found Mr. Pike, who had come at her quiet request with a leather folder of documents beneath his arm, and the grim steadiness of an old man finally permitted to be honest. The Duke had not yet appeared. The Dowager was waiting to bring him out, for the announcement, to time it, for the fullest room. Charlotte had a quarter of an hour perhaps before the cage closed. She meant to use it to open a different door, entirely. She did not raise her voice. She had learned long ago that a raised voice is the easiest thing in the world to dismiss. She stepped close to the Earl of Sandhurst, in the hearing of the dozen people nearest. And she said pleasantly, in the moth's mild tones, "Lord Sandhurst, I wonder if you would tell these good people about the Meridian Trading Company. You were so very involved in it. My father's name is on its papers, though he never knowingly signed a one. So is Mr. Harkness's, who is dead. So is Sir John Whitby's, who is also dead. Mr. Pike has the documents. Crane, I think, has the rest, and looks as though he would be glad to set it down at last." The easy laugh did not quite leave Sandhurst's face, but it stiffened on it, the way a thing stiffens in cold. "The Vane girl is overwrought," he said to the room. "Grief has unsettled her. One feels for the family." "One does," Charlotte agreed. "One has felt for the family a great deal. My father felt for it most of all on the night he understood what had been done to him." She turned, not to Sandhurst now, but to Mr. Pike. And Mr. Pike. Pike opened his folder, and the dozen became 2 dozen, and the music near the orchestra thinned and stopped as players felt the room change beneath them. Crane made a small broken sound and began, in a rush, to talk. It was at that moment that the Duke of Wexford entered the room, brought out by his mother on her arm for the announcement she had built her whole season to make. He stopped at the head of the floor. He saw the crowd gathered tight around the card-room, and at the center of it, a woman in a tea-colored gown, very still, speaking quietly, while an old solicitor laid papers on a table, and a sweating man confessed. He saw his mother's hand tighten on his sleeve. He heard her say, low and sharp, "Sebastian, come, we will not be delayed by that creature. The Vane girl is making a scene to ruin your evening, exactly as I warned you she would. A grasping, ruined nobody. A moth at the glass. Come now, before she shames us." All the Duke of Wexford looked at the woman at the center of the room. He looked at the key which had come loose from her bodice in the press of the crowd, and now hung visible on its ribbon at her throat, the brass catching the candlelight, the one thing of her father's she had never sold. He understood, in the way he had understood her from the first night, what he was seeing. He was seeing a woman spend the last of herself to do the right thing, in the one room where it could not be undone, expecting nothing, asking for no rescue, prepared to be finished. He removed his arm from his mother's hand. He crossed the room. He did not hurry, but the crowd opened before him, as crowds open before the thing they have been waiting for without knowing it, and the Dowager's voice followed him, and then faltered, and then stopped. He came to the center of the floor where Charlotte stood, and the whole bright room held its breath, and the Earl of Sandhurst's face went the color of ash. The Duke looked only at Charlotte. He took her hand, the one not closed around the brass key, and he turned with it to face the room that had spent a whole season deciding she was nothing. "Miss Vane is under my protection," he said. The silence after the line was a physical thing. It lay over the room like snowfall. Lady Marjorie's fan stopped at its measured height and then drifted down, forgotten. Lady Sophia, who had been told her whole life she was the correct choice, stood in her white and pearls and understood, for the first time, that being the correct choice and being chosen were not the same thing. And to her lasting credit, she did not weep, but only grew very pale and very quiet. The Earl of Sandhurst set down his claret with a hand that had begun at last to shake. And the Dowager Duchess of Wexford, keeper of her family's consequence for 40 years, stood quite alone at the head of her own ballroom and watched her son claim the moth, and her mouth opened and closed, and produced nothing because there was nothing in 40 years of script for this. Mr. Pike finished laying his papers. Crane finished his confession into the held silence, and named Sandhurst plainly, and the senior gentlemen of the room, the ones whose own affairs Mr. Sexstay Pike had kept for decades, gathered the documents with grave faces and the procedural weight that no fortune and no easy laugh could now displace. The thing was sealed, before the Dowager could find a single word to unseal it. Sandhurst was not struck. He was not dragged out. He was simply finished, in the slow social way that is worse than violence, by the gathering of honest men around a table of paper while a room of witnesses watched. By the season's end, his name would mean what the Vane name had been made to mean. And the 2 men he had buried beneath his fortune would have their accounts examined at last, and Charlotte's father, who had died believing himself a fool, would be known to have been a robbed and honest man. Charlotte stood in the center of it all with her hand in the Duke's, and she did not feel triumph, because her own heart had never had room for triumph, only for the long, quiet ache of wanting her father seen. She felt the ache ease. That was all. That was everything. The Dowager came to her later, near the cold supper, when the room had begun the slow business of pretending it had always known. She did not apologize, because women of 40 years' consequence do not apologize. But she stood before Charlotte and looked at her for a long moment, with eyes that had finally, belatedly troubled to actually see, and she said, "You told me you came to London on your father's business. I did not believe you. I find I am not accustomed to being told the plain truth by young women, and I mistook it for the only thing I understand, which is ambition. I was wrong about the substance of you, Miss Vane." She paused. "My son was not. He is rarely wrong about substance. It is the most inconvenient thing about him." And that from the Dowager Duchess of Wexford was very nearly an embrace. They were married in the new year, quietly, at the small church near Wexford's country seat, with snow coming down soft and steady over the grey stone and the bare trees. There was no crowd. There was Mr. Donne Pike, who gave a short, dry speech, and was surprised to find his own voice unsteady at the end of it. There was the Dowager, who wore grey and watched and said little, and once, when she thought no one observed her, touched her son's sleeve with something that was not consequence. And there was the small girl from the Holt Musicale, the musician's daughter, whom Charlotte had asked for and found and brought, dressed warm, to scatter dried winter petals on the church path, because Charlotte had not forgotten that the child had been the hinge on which her whole life had turned. That evening they sat together by the fire in the library, where he had once shown her the face of his dead wife. The snow went on falling past the tall windows. He had set Eleanor's portrait, at last, in its proper place on the mantel, no longer hidden in a closed hand, but standing in the warm light where a loved face belongs. And Charlotte had understood, without being told, that this was him setting down the weight he had carried, not the love. On the small table between them lay the brass key on its faded ribbon, the key to her father's study at Wiltshire, the one thing she had never sold. She had no more need to hide it against her skin. She turned it once in the firelight, the worn brass warm in her palm, and she thought of Edmund Vane, who had taught a small daughter how to see people clearly, and called it the only fortune he could leave her, and who had been right. "You called my gown deliberate," she said the first night. "No one had ever seen me before." "I know," said the Duke. He took her hand, the one that held the key, and folded both of his around it. "I have been looking ever since." Outside, the snow came down over the bare trees and the grey stone and the new home that had a place for her in it, and inside the fire held the room in gold, and the small warm key lay safe in 2 hands at last. "Thank you for staying until the end. If Charlotte's long, quiet courage moved you, leave a word below, and tell me the moment you knew the moth was never a moth at all.